Welcome to the 2025 Introduction to Psychology lecture series here that I'm putting on YouTube. This is what would you say, an idea that I've had back in 2020. I put a series of lectures up and I never finished them. I'm going to be finishing this and I'm going to be putting up other courses to YouTube as well. And the reason I'm doing this is, well, I recently moved to North Carolina and right now I'm in between jobs. And I want to put together something that's like a teaching demonstration. So that's one of the things that's different from 2020. And the other thing that's different is that since I've worked in the field clinically now for a while, I've got two things here. One is that I've got a counseling degree now on top of the psychology degree, so I can bring that clinical experience into this. So that way, not only are you learning things about psychology, but you might be able to find ways to take the information that I'm giving you guys and how to apply that to your own lives. And hopefully you can improve your life in some sense. So that's one thing to think about. It is the middle of the afternoon, and I like this to be organic. I'm not going to sit here and give you guys a bunch of rehearsed stuff. I'm going to try to do this like you would see in a classroom. So that means that any tangents or any thoughts that come to mind, it's just going to come as it comes. So the slides were built in 2019. That's why the 2019 date is there. I'm trying to figure out camera angle, but that's why it says 2019. So I haven't changed the slides. Just the information in the video is going to be a little different. Also, got myself a little bit healthier than when I did this in 2020 or 2019. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so this is the layout. This is a proposed layout. So I'm going to do this in two ways. One, I'm going to read from the slides. Yeah, we'll do it this way. So we'll read from this slide. So this is kind of what it would look like if this was for a classroom in a university or a community college. And then the other thing is something that you could do if you wanted to. So let's get into it, right? So the layout, right? So I'm taking a philosophical way of doing this. So I'm going to be using two books. This one, the Psychology in Perspective by Tavris and Wade from 2001, and The Story of Psychology. This is a primary text from Morton Hunt, which is a narrative history of psychology, and then various texts, books, clinical manuals, and other things that I've kind of gathered in the last 5 years. Kind of give you what would you say, a good narrative of the history of psychology, as well as breaking the 5 perspectives down. And I'm going to teach it out of order, right? So it first starts with the biological perspective and it ends with the psychodynamic perspective, and then it kind of leads into the mental disorders. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the psychoanalytic perspective first. And the reason I want to do that first is because Freud and Jung and Adler and the other psychoanalysts, they were really the first clinical medical psychologists, and they were really the first ones to deal with the mental disorders. But canonically and chronologically, the psychoanalysts also came first. So we're going to talk about the psychoanalysts. Then we're going to talk about the learning perspective with the behaviorists, the cognitivists, and then we're going to go into the sociocultural perspective because that's where social psychology and culture and all of that. And then we'll go into the biological perspective. So that's the brain and the neurons and all of that. So we'll end with the biology. And then I'll go into a very brief exit part of the lecture series on the mental disorders, because that'll set up the next class that I'm going to try to design, which is going to be psychopathology mixed with abnormal psych. The plan with that one is to kind of bridge the gap between abnormal psych and psychopathology. So abnormal psych is just your basic run through of the different disorders, personality disorders, mental disorders, and all of that, without going into the psychometrics for diagnosing or the treatment models of all of that. Just kind of, again, I want to bridge the gap with talking about the mental disorders as well as giving you the psychopathology end of it. So it's really, you're going to get a 2-for-1 out of it. Instead of taking 2 separate courses like you would in college, I'm going to try to give you a comprehensive one and done type of course. So that's the one thing I'd like to do. And so, yeah, psychology from the beginning was rooted in philosophy. And so this section will definitely, this introductory course will be very philosophical in nature, at least until we get to the biology component, because biology is the objective science of things, and psychology doesn't necessarily, I don't want to misspeak, but I don't think that psychology predominantly inhabits the biological frame so much as it inhabits the philosophical frame. That's one way of thinking about that, right? So when it comes to the history of psychology as a discipline and how it's tied to the different, say, therapists, psychoanalysts, clinicians, that's the right way of thinking about it. The different clinicians and theorists that we're going to talk about in the course of going through this, because, the behaviorists, they were theorists in a sense, and some of their ideas were integrated into different psychotherapeutic modalities. It's another way of thinking about that. And so that's how we're going to cover the entirety of all of this, right? And so let's talk about the different roles that psychologists will play in this broad field, right? So there's going to be different specialties. So there's personality psychology, and I'm going to put together a personality course for you guys. I'm going to talk about personality theory, personality disorders, some of the psychometrics and diagnostic tools used in that domain, as well as for measuring treatment outcomes. And I could tell you some pretty cool stories about my experience in working with fellows with pervasive personality pathology. So that'll be pretty interesting. There's social psychology. So fans of Jonathan Haidt in particular probably are familiar with social psychology to the degree that, Jonathan Haidt talks about morality and how groups of people tend to live together based on shared morality and their moral intuitions, which kind of goes into the moral matrices that can be measured and theorized in that sense. But that's moral psychology, which is a subset of social psychology. And then there's, of course, developmental psychologists. There's the depth psychologist, so that's the school of thought that Jung kind of gave birth to in some sense, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the Carl Jung lecture. So if this was a university course, I would be asking for 3 projects to be done. One would be a critical thinking exercise, and that would just be to take something out of this that you disagree with, and I would say, okay, if you disagree with this, I need you to make the strongest argument for that which you disagree with, because there's an interesting thing that happens when you really try to make the strongest case for something you disagree with. You'll find yourself actually agreeing with it more than you would disagree with it, interestingly enough, and there's a broad literature on that. Then there would be another the essay one, where you would figure out where you want to go with your life and how you would intend to achieve that, because the idea would be that you would break that overarching goal down into smaller sub goals that would be easily able to be obtained, and they'd have to be specific and measurable and all of that. And then pick a DSM diagnosis, because we're going to talk about the mental disorders, like I said, very briefly, but I would cut that out. I don't think that would be really a good idea, let's say, because this isn't a psychopathology course. We just barely touch it, because like I said, the outro to Introduction to Psychology would lead you into the abnormal psych/psychopathology course. So I would take that out, and I would say maybe write about a dream, because I love the psychoanalysts and the and dream analysis is a pretty cool thing. And I can talk a bit about that when I do the lecture on the psychoanalysts. That's another thing too that we'll talk about there when we introduce that particular module is well, they call it the psychodynamic perspective, and fair enough, that's the modern acceptable term for it, but I think I like the term psychoanalytic better, and I'm a fan of the idea of the that the psychoanalysts had, and I just think psychoanalysis is just a cooler word than psychodynamic, and they have their differences, and I've managed to make both the psychoanalytically minded psychologist and the psychodynamic psychologist very angry with me because I conceptualize them as, they're roughly the same thing. The only difference is the scale of time it takes to solve a patient's problem. So I guess, well, you could say, okay, well, the psychodynamic therapists get mad at me because I say, well, we're more directive. We don't just sit there and listen for a year before we decide to help you. Whereas the psychoanalyst will sit there for a year and just listen to you before they try to help you out. And the psychoanalysts look at the psychodynamic folks as, they've bastardized the original idea of allowing the client to just say whatever's on their mind or talk about what dreams they had and figure out what's going on with their life that way. I think, the idea that you're working with the unconscious is what makes them the same, and they all have their roots with Freud and Bloor and Jung and the other psychoanalysts, so you can't really get too upset over the fact that they share the same theoretical framework. So that's that's the psychoanalyst versus the psychodynamic therapists in a nutshell, and we'll go more in depth with that like I said, when we get to the psychoanalytic lecture. Okay, so the next slide here, if I can get this bloody thing to work. Yay! So let's talk about the brief history of psychology. So that's what it is. Well, psychology is a discipline, just like psychiatry is a discipline, social work is a discipline, sociology is a discipline, um, medicine is a discipline. So it's a discipline within the social sciences. It just involves, the study of the human mind and how it influences behavior. The technical definition is the study of the mind and how it behaves, but the mind doesn't necessarily behave. The mind it's a piece in the overall puzzle of the human being and how the human being behaves and how the human being acts and how the human being interacts. Because, well, we can get into that when we get into the personality course where, I've thought of personality for a while now, and I think personality can be best described as an interface between reality and the person themselves, and it's through a set of adapted traits, which is traits along the Big Five model, and that's my area of expertise is the Big Five model of personality, and I think that your personality traits and all the sub-traits or subcomponents of each trait have evolved in a manner that allows you to interact with reality in all of its different levels, and that's all I'm going to say about that because I don't want to take that too damn deep down into a rabbit hole that we can't get out of. So we'll try not to do that, eh? And the discipline does have many facets. We talked about personality psychology, social psychology, clinical, there's the behaviorists, there's emotion, motivation psychology, and I think a psychology is like a cake. You can slice that damn thing so many bloody ways, and you can have your cake and you can eat it too, which is kind of nice if you think about it that way. But all of the different psychology, subsects, and psychology as a whole has kind of really started off, as a branch of philosophy that just asked the questions of who am I? Why am I here? Why am I doing the things that I'm doing? What's the purpose and the meaning of all of this? Right? And in order to answer those questions, it required observations related to the mental processes And that's really how the ancient world started. Descartes, I forget who it was. I think, well, it doesn't matter. But when they said, I think, therefore I am, it's like, well, yeah, we do think. And that's why we ask the questions of who are we and why are we here and what are we doing and what's the meaning of all of this. And we've been trying to sort those answers out ever since. So, yeah. So when most people think of psychology, they think of those pop psych self-help books and those television psychologists. Of course, some of the television psychologists actually were clinicians at one time. Dr. Phil was a medical psychologist and clinical psychologist, and he just kind of found a way into the television world that worked. Then you had people like Myers and Briggs who came together and came up with that wonderful Myers-Briggs personality test that you see all over the bloody internet. And that's just pop psych. It's a bastardization of Jung's book on the psychological types, and it's only reliable in two metrics, and that's introversion versus extroversion, which is really neuroticism versus extroversion from the big five. As far as being, judging, perceiving, sensing, intuitive, and all of that, I guess that just kind of depends more on how you're feeling that day. So it's not really reliable by any true sense of a diagnostic instrument, but here we are. That's how it is, eh? So yeah, that's the pop psych. Others will tend to think more along the lines of the schizophrenic patients or those with multiple personality disorder, which was a big thing back in the 70s and 80s. Everybody had multiple personality disorder. The problem with that is, well, it's such a rare condition that psychiatrists and psychologists can't even agree that the diagnosis even exists, and there's no real way to measure that objectively because it is based on subjective experience, and the only way you could, I think, the only way that you could possibly measure that with any valid sense would be to have each personality undergo personality testing with something like the MMPI, the PAI, or a big five assessment, and just have to test and retest and retest and retest each individual personality to see if you get actual different personality. What the hell is the word I'm looking for? Basically, their own personality profile. That's the way to think about it. That every alter would have to have its own personality profile. That would be repeatedly reliable across different testings, but I don't even know because you'd be testing the same person like 50 damn times before you figure that out. I don't even know if that's even really a good procedure. I haven't made it to the PhD level, so I don't even know if that's even something that can even be done. But it's something to think about. And psychology is a science, or at least that's what we're trying to be. We're more like applied science. If you want to get really specific about it, there's no real objective science to psychology except maybe the behaviorists. They're the closest we got to it. I would say psychometrics would be the next closest we get to with like the personality psychologists because they do a lot of the measurements, and so psychometrics is the closest thing you can get to an empirical science. And we're more of a soft science, and we have deep roots that are tied to philosophy. And some of these philosophers, this will be the only time we hear about them, and some of them are going to pop up later when we talk about different, all the different traditions, especially when we go over the psychoanalytic tradition, because there's a branch of the psychoanalysts that came from philosophers. And we'll talk about those philosophers in more detail there. So I'm not going to get too hung up in the weeds on the philosophers that I'm about to kind of talk about as we get through this. So, hey, what do you know? We're 20 minutes in, and I think I'm making good coherent sense so far. All right. So, ancient Greece and philosophy was psychology that has managed to interweave itself this way as far back as ancient Greece. So Hippocrates, don't have to memorize the date. All you have to know is that he was the father of medicine. This is where the Hippocratic Oath comes in, by the way, the idea of do no harm. And he tried to separate religious superstition from medicine. So his idea was that you had four, what do they call it? Well, what was it? The four humors. That's right. God, I can't even think. So the four humors, right? You had yellow bile, which was fire. You had black bile associated with earth, phlegm with water, and blood with air. And they were used to describe temperaments of somebody who would have been associated with blood, would have said to have a sanguine nature, which would have branded them as kind of melancholic and neurotic, I guess, is one way of thinking about that. And that the humors had to be in perfect balance, and if they weren't, then mental or physical illness would manifest itself. So he really took it out of the idea of, what would you say, took it out of the idea of superstition and possession by the gods and made it that, well, your humors, your fluids are out of whack, and if they're out of whack, you're out of whack, and this is where the idea of wackiness and madness kind of comes from, because madness is said to have come from moistness in the brain, and according to the humor theory of ancient Greece, madness came from too much phlegm, and it manifested itself as quiet disinterest in those around them. And too much bile made those who had gone mad kind of restless and aggressive. And so the phlegmatic, quiet, disinterested person, that's more in line with, say, someone who's more of the schizoid persuasion. So in personality disorders, this schizoid personality disorder is more associated with people who they don't care about praise, they don't care about criticism, they don't have close relationships with family members, they don't have a whole lot of friends, if any. They're really the archetypical hermit on the mountain that would just prefer to be left alone. And they don't get too mad unless they're bothered by people. But somebody criticizing them for having no friends, they could care less. And or someone praises them for something good they do, they don't even really react to it all that much. And too much bile made people kind of manic and noisy and restless and impulsive. And so that's not quite so good. And mania is an interesting thing. When you think of bipolar disorder, you think of somebody who's extremely manic. The archetype for that is like somebody who's extremely happy and energetic and just wants to have fun 24/7. And I have never seen a euphoric person with mania. They're usually very irritable, angry, want to fight at the drop of a hat, will insult you, curse at you, buck up on you. They don't sleep. They talk so damn fast that you have to ask them, can you please slow it down, or I'm not going to be able to follow anything that you have to say worth anything. And they can't seem to stop talking. That's the pressure of speech, right? They just keep talking and talking and talking and talking, and their thought process is so fast that the ideas just fly out of them, and you can't keep track of it, and they go on these tangents that make no damn sense, and it's just they're not the most easy to be around clients if you decide to go the clinical route or you want to go into counseling or clinical psychology. Mania is really one of those really touch and go type diagnoses to think about. I think you're getting more clinical stuff out of this than the first time we went through this. This is interesting to see the evolution of the. Go back and watch the original introduction to psychology lecture, and then you can compare it to this one. You can tell me what you think. Socrates. Now he was an interesting. He was a Greek philosopher. And he contributed to psychology through how he taught his students. Because he never lectured at them or talked at them. He just would ask them questions and they were able to find the truth themselves. And this method was described as a dialectic. It was between two people. And this is actually where they get the idea of dialectical behavior therapy from. They also get it from Hegelian dialectics. I'm not going into Hegel because I don't bloody understand Hegel. Holding two contrary paradoxical ideas in balance with each other doesn't make too much sense to me because I'm more of a Rogerian, and we'll get into that when we talk about the humanists when it is as part of the psychodynamic slash psychoanalytic perspective. Well, we might talk on the humanistic perspective because they were more phenomenologists, and they kind of came out of the existentialist school of things. But I'll give you a basic idea. So in Hegelian dialectics, in dialectical behavior therapy, the idea is that you can have an emotional mind where you go, oh, your emotions are where you lead with all of the time. And then you have the rational mind, which is just completely logic, reason, rationality with no respect for the emotional component of life. And the idea is that you bring those two into balance with one another with what's called the wise mind. But sometimes there are two things that are going to be completely opposed to one another that I don't think it's helpful to try to hold that stuff in balance. You know, you're not my client, so I'm not going to sit here and curse at you. But it is YouTube, so I have to be very careful with the swearing. But here's the idea. So Rogers was all about congruence and integrating yourself. And so the idea is that the things that you say and the things that you do have to match. And you can get into what's called a performative contradiction, where you can say one thing and do something else. I had a client like this. He would always say, well, I don't believe that it's okay to call people racial slurs, and I don't think it's okay to attack people, but he would engage in these actions. And in therapy, I was like, well, here's what you're saying that you believe. Here's what you're doing. And do you understand what you're doing is you are engaging in a performative contradiction, because the things that you're telling me and the things you're doing, they don't match. And so here's what you need to do. You need to take what you say and you need to act it out, or you need to make your words match your actions so that way you're actually congruent and integrated with yourself instead of acting out this paradox, because that's actually what you're doing, and that's part of the reason why you're in a psych hospital, and that's why you are going to continue to stay if you don't get yourself out of that. Smart fella, just really didn't think things through sometimes. But we were able to kind of get him integrated in that sense. But in cognitive behavioral therapy, we call the questioning, where you help a client kind of answer their own questions, is Socratic questioning. It's the idea that, like, okay, well, let's say you're coming to me because you're depressed, and you tell me your life's pretty much working for you. You and your wife are getting along, and the kids are behaving themselves, and you're doing pretty good at work, but you still feel hopeless and depressed and worthless. And I say, okay, well, where's the evidence that you're worthless here? Let's walk through that. Tell me the things that actually prove that you are worthless. And of course, a client who's got a successful life going on, they're not going to be able to answer that question at all. They're not. And so it's like, okay, well, you asking these questions, looking for the evidence to try to prove their point that they're bringing to you, but when they realize that they don't really have any evidence for it, they start to think, okay, well, maybe things aren't as bad as we think they are, and if we don't get it together, then we're never going to get past this. That's another way of thinking about that. So that's kind of what the Socratic questioning is like. And so the other thing that's pretty cool about Socrates is he had this thing called the daemon, which was a term that he used for his own conscience. And so he called it his demon. And this is what he would consult to determine the correct actions to be taken and would be able to just help him discern, whether he believed what he was saying and whether that was true or not. And of course, because he would try to say what he thought to be true, well, that got him into a bit of trouble. In fact, toward the end of his life, he was accused of impiety, which was the practice of not worshiping the gods of the state and corrupting the minds of the youth. And they didn't want to kill him because he was a brilliant guy, so they had told him he needed to leave the city or that he would be found guilty and he would be put to death. And he consulted his conscience, his daemon, let's say, and just was like, should I leave? And of course, his conscience said, well, you haven't really done anything wrong, and putting you to death, I mean, death is not as bad as, lying, let's say. That's what he thought. He thought, well, lying would be worse than death, and so he refused to flee Athens and drank poison as a consequence of that. So he really lived out the idea of, you want to live out an honest, truthful life, then we'll stake your life on that, and that's what he did. Then Aristotle comes along, and he was known for his thoughts on functionality. He thought that the psyche wasn't something outside of you, that, the psyche is what it does. The psyche is what thinks. The psyche is what perceives. The psyche is what gains information through experience in the world. And so his philosophy would become the foundation for what would become neuroscience, because the psyche was the steps that were taken when it came to thinking, and the neuropsychologists and the neuroscientists are trying to understand thinking and consciousness, which they haven't made any headway in the last, 20, 30 years. I think they're still trying to figure out what consciousness is and what its purpose is, because you could make the argument there's a lot of creatures that are awake, but they're not exactly conscious in the same way human beings are, which is a really interesting thing about that makes us unique as a species, is that we're not just conscious, we're self-conscious, self-aware, and we're self-aware to the point that we even know that eventually we're going to die. Because, well, everybody that's ever been alive is going to die, and everybody that's died was alive once. And that's a reminder of our own mortality, and that kind of drives at well, that's one of the things about, anxiety. And we think anxiety is this condition of mental illness. I think anxiety is kind of built into our existence, right? Because we are going to die, and the idea is, what do we leave behind when we die? And I'm not talking about this in the objective sense that you leave a body and you leave your family and you have your children as your legacy, but it's kind of like, what's the body of work you leave behind? And a lot of people are afraid that they're going to die and leave nothing behind, and that's it. That's final, and that's what we wrestle with. And so it's no question why people get anxious and depressed in their life, especially midlife, right? Because, you can be an idiot for the first 20 years of your life because you're a child, for at least the first 12 years where it's playtime and all you have to be concerned about is, going to school and hanging out with your friends. And then when you're a teenager and you learn to drive, you get your girlfriend, you have your first kiss, you go to the prom, have your car. And then in your early 20s, you're trying to go to college and go to university, get yourself educated, and pick up something that would set you up for a career or a job. And then, by the time you're 30, you get married, you have kids, because that's what you do. That's what people have always done. And then by the time you're 40 or 50, the kids are growing up. You're back to, it's back to just you and your spouse, and trying to, I guess, rediscover life for you and what that means. So yeah, that's well, that's consciousness, eh? But we'll talk about that when we get to the learning perspective and the cognitivists, as they call it in the textbook, the cognitive psychologists, the cognitive thinkers. Then we get to the modern era, right? So it's a huge leap between the ancient world and the modern world. But we have Thomas Hobbes here, and he was known as the first English empirical psychologist because he presupposed that the events were matter in motion. Therefore, thoughts were nothing more than the movement of atoms in the brain. Now, this idea is kind of half correct because we know the neurons have axons, which pick up neurochemical signals in the brain that relay information, and his ideas on how men could only be civilized through fear of monarchy type of rule would give rise to the phrase of the Hobbesian nightmare, right? Of men in conflict with one another. However, this may only be half correct, but we can touch on that later. So that was his thing, was that human beings were by nature violent, and it was only in a world where we're in competition, lethal competition with one another, that but it was through fear of authority that made us good. So society made man good. Otherwise, we would just be a bunch of violent chimpanzees because we share much of our DNA with chimpanzees, and they're our closest living uh, next of kin, let's say, in the animal kingdom is the chimpanzee. And chimps can be quite terrifying. I mean, they will tear a person's face off. That's why they don't make good pets. That's supposed to be our nature, according to Hobbes. Now, John Locke, he's known as the father of liberalism, and he's kind of the first example of what psychologists call the blank slate, or as he called it, the tabula rasa. And this is a philosophy that contains this epistemological assumption. Now, epistemology is kind of a study of how we come to know things. And his idea was that the human mind has to experience the world to gain and express knowledge. Now, what we know, especially from evolutionary psychologists like Steven Pinker, is that this idea was challenged and argued, and it's come to pass that we know that the mind and the brain has these innate psychological processes that allow for social learning. And so cognitive scientists agree that based on the evolutionary psychological research is that we're not blank slates. We have innate temperaments, right? Because people tend to think and act their temperament. So we have innate temperaments. We have the ability to learn things socially, but we're not blank slates. You know, that's the other thing that the behaviorists believe is that we were blank slates and we could be trained to behave and do all sorts of things that we typically wouldn't do, which is a bunch of nonsense. And Steven Pinker wrote this book called The Blank Slate. And he takes the blank slate theorists to task and really just kind of demolishes their argument. But there are still some people, especially the radical social constructivist types, that think that we are a blank slate and that we can be molded into some image that they think that they can mold us into. But that's a bunch of nonsense, and it's been debunked. And why we're still arguing about this today, just don't quite understand it, but it is the world that we live in. I mean, we have flat earthers, for Christ's sake, so take that with it what you will. Immanuel Kant is another philosopher, and he is considered one of the greatest modern philosophers, though he's also the most difficult to understand. And he thought that it was true knowledge that doesn't. He thought that true knowledge does come from experience, but it's not the only source for the mind. He believed that the mind was too subjective to have this a priori basis. However, as we've managed to expand our knowledge in the psychological field, we know this is simply not the case, and that we can use experimental models to measure phenomena empirically. Now, to Kant's credit, his thinking on objects occupying different categories leads to the conclusion that there are an infinite number of ways that you can interpret a near finite amount of things. So basically the idea is that there's an infinite way to interpret a finite set of phenomena, which is true, because you could look at it. You know, this thing behind that I'm sitting on is a chair. That's a category, but a tree stump can also fit the chair category because you can sit on a tree stump. And so that is kind of how our mind works, is that we tend to categorize things in ways, and we tend to categorize things more on functionality. So like this can of soda here is a cup. Now obviously it's not a cup in the traditional cup sense, but it does contain liquid and you can drink from it, much like a cup. So cup and can share the category of cup based on the utility that you can pick it up and you can drink from it. So your perceptions are predicated on actions when it comes to the category thing. So we can interpret the can as a aluminum can full of soda, and it's also a cup of something you can drink. That's probably the most accidental way of making that point. You gotta love when you have your home office and you can just use things to put points on things, I think. And then Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a German philosopher he really influenced existentialism and intellectualism and psychology. So he was considered one of the greatest existential philosophers. He was also a psychologist in many ways. And he was very critical of the dogmatism in Christianity. However, in the gay science, and he also wrote about it in the Will to Power as well, that when he pronounced the death of God, which was not this triumphant thing that the radical atheist types try to trumpet forth, that there would be a loss of a universal perspective on things. And so it was his observation that the Catholic Church was investing time in the exploration, the scientific exploration of the world, that it would be the church who would disprove the existence of God, because the more you understand the natural world, the less you have to attribute to, say, the supernatural creator of all things. And so when he announced the death of God, he supposed that universal perspectives would be lost, as well as the demolition of all values, right? You knock out the cornerstone of your own society, because if God's at the top of the hierarchy of value and you demolish that out, then two things are going to happen. Either human beings are going to have to learn to create their own values. So that's the idea of the Übermensch, the Superman. Or that there would be this pervasive nihilism that would infect people. This idea that nothing's meaningless and therefore you can just do whatever you want, and people are nihilistic and don't believe in anything, then they'll fall for everything. And that would lead to this falling in love with the idea of, the idea that, well, if there's no value, then everything has to be equal, and that was what the Marxists back in the 1800s, that's what they were clamoring on about in, say, Imperial Russia and other places where, you had the peasant classes who were seen as oppressed. And, and so he didn't say it so explicitly in the Will of Power, but basically said that, the Marxist communist types that were rallying about, he said, well, maybe if they got into power, maybe we would learn something from the experience, but it would kill many people, because you would have the state taking the place of God, and anytime the state has that much power, it becomes corrupt and tyrannical and totalitarian. And because of that idea that nihilism would affect people, he came to really respect Dostoevsky's literary works, because Dostoevsky was kind of able to analyze the consequence of nihilism, and he did it through his characters. In fact, he was so worried about nihilism and the death of God that when he read Dostoevsky, he would say that Dostoevsky, and this is his actual quote, was that Dostoevsky is the only psychologist that I ever had anything else to learn from. And that's a hell of a thing to say, because Nietzsche also said that he could write in a single sentence what other people would take a book to say. Very, very arrogant statement. Unless you've actually read Nietzsche, then you would come to find out that not only was that an arrogant statement, but it was also very true. And so if you're interested in Nietzsche's work, I would say either Beyond Good and Evil or The Genealogy of Morals are two books that I would recommend that you read first to get an introduction to Nietzsche's work. And then if you really want to explore European nihilism at the time, The Will to Power is a book that I highly recommend. And then his idea of the Ubermensch, the Superman, the creating your own values, that was laid out in Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is another very interesting book of his. It was actually one of the shorter books that Nietzsche wrote, but definitely highlighted things about the human condition and the need for value in human life, for sure. Which brings us to Dostoevsky, Russian author. Let me try that one again. Russian author and philosopher who explored the human condition and psychology of spiritual, social, and political atmospheres throughout his novels. Literary critics have called him one of the greatest psychologists of all time. And so he explored philosophy and psychology in his novels. His two greatest works, I think, are the Brothers Karamazov, which explored nihilism from behavioral and spiritual perspectives, as well as Crime and Punishment. And the reason I think those two books are so great is in Crime and Punishment, specifically the main character Raskolnikov. He's this law student who lives in poverty. He becomes bitter, nihilistic because he has no money, and he has to pawn his possessions off to this pawnbroker who's this really nasty lady. She has this niece who she basically tyrannizes and makes this slave because she's a little cognitively slow. And based on this lady's behavior, like you could make the argument that maybe she should die, and you can rationalize it because she's just this terrible person, and everybody in Russia in this village would be better off. And not only that, he could use the wealth that she squanders away to give to his mother, so his sister doesn't have to prostitute herself off in this arranged marriage to this very not so nice fella who's wealthy, and Raskolnikov actually follows through with the murder. And after that, he undergoes this transformation where his own conscience punishes him. It's only until he confesses to the murder and gets sent off to Siberia that he actually feels free for the first time since the murder, because his own conscience kind of tortured him. Because at first he rationalizes, because he's this educated law student, that, well, she would just be, the world would be better off without people like that in the world, and I'll take her out. And is able to rationalize it, but once he commits the act, then his conscience kind of takes him to task and rakes him over the coals for it. So, great book, highly recommended if you're interested in existential themes and spirituality and the human condition. In Dostoevsky really nailed that when he wrote that book. And so we're here to the summary. So let's kind of summarize what we've talked about in this short lecture today. So psychology, again, it's a discipline that studies the human mind, human behavior, and basically studies the human itself. Many people think of the pop psych stuff, which includes self-help books, and I'm not going to deride self-help because there are some self-help books that are actually pretty helpful, as we'll talk about when we talk about the existential psychologist. Contemporary existentialist Jordan Peterson wrote 12 Rules for Life. That's a self-help book that's actually helped people. So I'm not going to deride the self-help books. I'm not going to deride the television shows either, because if it's a medium that you can use as a way to help a lot of people have better lives, then who the hell am I to criticize that? Psychology is a very broad discipline. There are many facets and areas of specialization. And I'm going to try to come at this from my areas of expertise in personality psychology, along with the experience I have as a clinician. So we'll see how that goes. And it's deeply rooted in philosophy. That philosophy goes back to ancient Greece. It's pervaded through the modern era. And the relationship between philosophy and the empirical sciences is what has allowed psychology to be a science. It's applied. You have to try out many things and see what works. And so the next lecture, I don't know if I'll probably post it next week, kind of in line with what the slide says. But next week we'll talk about the proto-psychologists. They're the first ones to really call themselves psychologists. So there'll be Wilhelm Wundt, William James, and those folks, and that'll be a pretty good introduction to things. And then I guess we'll talk about learning and studying human behavior. Yeah, studying human behavior and an introduction to all of that. That'll give us a really good, strong foundation before we jump around, and then we'll jump around into the psychoanalysts and all of that in the psychodynamic perspective. But we're going to separate that all out from the psychoanalysts, the humanists and phenomenologists, the existentialists. Then we'll learn about the behaviorists, the cognitivists, and we can talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive restructuring I guess that'll give you some tools to kind of help you deal with your own things that you might be dealing with, whether it's distorted thinking or other things that perhaps the techniques in cognitive behavioral therapy could help you with. And we'll jump around and we'll talk about all of that. Well, this is the first psychology video for 2025 for my channel, so I hope you enjoyed it, and if so, please like, subscribe, and leave me a comment. And if you didn't like it, you can leave a comment, because I can't do anything better if you don't give me any suggestions, because this is for free, this is for you guys. So thank you, and have a good evening, and we'll catch you on the next lecture.